Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Brookings, India. In this week's development seminar, I'm personally very proud to introduce you to Professor Jonathan Morduch. He is a giant in the area of financial inclusion, microfinance. Jonathan is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at New York University. He has been a guide, mentor, and a personal inspiration for me in terms of his honesty at approaching research. I have learned a great deal. Jonathan has ventured into a new area for his own research, and for most of us who have been following the financial inclusion debate globally, away from the emerging markets and the developing markets, towards what does financial exclusion and vulnerability look like in developed markets. What are the kinds of dynamics of people moving in and out of formal financial markets, and how do the poor really live in an otherwise developed economy? So, Jonathan, the floor is yours. You have an hour to present, and if you'd like, we can take questions. We are in, but we could even read this, depending on whatever you decide.
I'm happy to do questions as we go along.
Excellent. So, please.
Shamika, thank you very much for that kind introduction. We have a little bit of an echo, but I'm getting a thumbs up signal, so it must be good. It's a real pleasure to be here, and as Shamika is saying, it's a bit of a change for me. I have spent my time as an economist thinking about problems. Let's try this. Thinking about problems from the perspective of markets and finance in India, in Bangladesh. I've mostly worked in Asia. But a few years ago, after some work that had started in India and Bangladesh and South Africa, I was approached by two funders who said, if you want to take what you've been doing and come to the United States and try to spend some time learning about households and markets in the US, bringing on board what you've learned over the years in India, they said they would fund me. And so the Ford Foundation, the Citibank Foundation, sort of agreed to do this crazy thing, which is to bring this development economist on board to try to spend some time with American families. And what I want to share with you is a very different picture of what's going on in America than what we often understand. So it's a real pleasure to be here sharing this. Shamika, thank you for those kind words. I have to say one of the great pleasures of being an academic is your former students move on in the world, and eventually they become your teachers in many ways. Certainly Shamika is now my co-author. We finished some work in Andhra Pradesh a couple years ago on an ultra-poor program. But it's a real pleasure to move from being a teacher and a student to being a student teaching the teacher. So thank you. It's really exciting to be here and for all the interesting work that you're doing. So today I'm going to talk about a sense of anxiety that American families are facing. And it's a bit of a puzzle. And the way to understand the puzzle, or the only way that I could figure out, was to actually spend time with families, real time with families, not just going in and asking surveys the way that economists usually do, but really spending time over weeks and weeks and weeks, over a full year, getting to know a small group of families, listening to their concerns, and telling their stories. So I want to focus on some stories about the lives of low and middle income families, drawing on a co-authored book with Rachel Schneider. So when the funder said, Jonathan, if you want to come to the US and do some work in the US, we'll back you, they also said, Jonathan, you don't know anything about the US really. And so they said, but Rachel Schneider can help. She's a terrific expert on financial services innovation. And even though the book and what I want to share is not about financial services innovation, she's been a great intellectual partner. The donors actually also said, and Jonathan, you never get anything done on time. And Rachel will make sure that we get this book completed. So in many ways, I'm glad for this partnership, and this project I want to share is there've been many organizations involved, our centers, and also very much the funders. I want to start with a chart that is probably very familiar to everyone here, some version of it. And this is from Thomas Piketty's work with collaborators, Emmanuel Saez, Gabriel Zuckman, and others, Tony Atkinson, on these incredible changes in inequality around the world. And here are the charts from the US. This is looking at the income share of the top 10%. I'm sure you've seen the figures for the top 1% and the top 10th of 1%. They all have the same sense. The striking thing about the figure is this incredible increase in inequality that has happened since 1970. What I want to argue is that while that has been happening, there's also been a shift in power, right? It's been enabled by a shift in power. And that shift has been going toward shareholders, toward employers, away from workers. And part of the story behind this, well, we focus on the richest of the rich. Part of the story is also what's happening in the rest of the distribution, in the bottom of the distribution. And what's sort of hidden here by looking at the top 10% or top 1% is that the bottom 50% in America have had stagnant incomes over the same period. No real growth at all. And the story that I want to tell goes even deeper than that, which is that not only have incomes been stagnant, but these same processes, the decline of unions, the spread of automation, globalization, has been leading to changes like this. And this is the first version of it. This is a picture that comes from the PSID. So for you economics nerds, that's the panel study of income dynamics. It's this amazing study in the US which follows the same households year after year after year. And what this is showing is that there's been an increase in this is the standard deviation of household economic growth. But that's just a way of saying variability from year to year in people's incomes. And a 29% increase in this measure over the same period that Piketty and his collaborators have been looking. So not only has there been an increase in inequality, there's been an increase in instability. And this here is year-to-year instability. And in fact, the increase in year-to-year instability has been greater than the increase in inequality. It's been faster and more pronounced, but it gets much less attention.
How do you define instability?
So here, there are various measures. This is looking from year to year across all these households, so it's several thousand households, and looking at the variability of those movements from year to year. And that's become wider. A different way to look at it, which is more straightforward and would give a similar story, would be looking at the probability that in any given year your income would drop dramatically, say by 50%. That kind of catastrophic income decline's also been, the probability of that's also been climbing year after year. Okay. So that's a problem that's been leading to insecurity in America and leading to the sense for many families that they're walking a tightrope, that they're walking a high wire. The language of precariousness is often invoked. The idea that, things are going okay right now, but one might lose one's job. There may be some health problem. That 50% drop in income or something like that could happen at any moment, and we're unprotected. That's the language. In fact, there was a prominent book that came out just before the recession called High Wire, remarking on this transition. Another book by a Yale political scientist, Jacob Hacker, called The Great Risk Shift, all about this story. One of the things that happened, though, is that as that story was starting to be formulated, the Great Recession emerged, 2007, 2008, played out through 2009. And that changed the conversation and took attention away from this toward that. It really sort of grabbed all the focus. And so discussions around the Great Risk Shift and precariousness took a backseat. So when the Ford Foundation, the City Foundation approached us, they said, some time has gone by now. let's go back and try to understand where we've landed, where households are. And so what I want to share then begins with a broader story. It begins with this. During this same period that Piketty has been looking at, 1970 to now, there's also been a profound shift in the labor market. Right? As you know, the American economy used to have a fairly robust manufacturing sector, right? And that there's been a massive shift in the kinds of jobs that people have away from manufacturing and away from sort of industrial work, repair work, even clerical work, administrative work, toward two sides, toward retail and the service sector that's grown incredibly, and toward technical and professional work on the other side. And that has meant this hollowing out of the labor market. Middle skill jobs have fallen away, they've disappeared, and we've seen growth on both sides. And so the American middle class, as we know, has been suffering or trying to figure out how to proceed in this context. And I'm just one moment on the question. And so this is described by others, David Otter at MIT, many others, as a hollowing out of the labor market, right? And there's been work at Brookings, going back and forth on just how it's played out. But it's been a drop in the middle and also a drop in the kinds of jobs, repair jobs, manufacturing jobs, clerical jobs. Those jobs used to be steady, reliable jobs. But I want to tell a story then about how these new jobs are playing out for families.
Was that representation was an action? I just trying to visually, I guess, the area of the middle should be equal to the area of the side in some sense.
Yes, yeah, it's the percentage change in the employment share.
So overall, that would be zero, right? I mean,
yes, it's a redistribution, right, which has led to a hollowing out. Yes, there is on net, and this is the part of the puzzle. Unemployment has remained fairly low. Right? It's 4.3% in America now. So most people have jobs. They've just shuffled in the kinds of jobs they're having.
do we have a sense of what's moving where, in some sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So from the middle, many have gone down, right? And some, with some extra education, have gone up. There's been part of this, which I'm not going to focus on today, is an increasing cleavage between those who've finished college and those who haven't. Right? Even if you've taken a few college classes but haven't completed, you're in a different world, and that's pushed you down. And the ones who've finished college are able to gain from that. And the Trump story is largely a story of many of those people who haven't finished college, but who used to be able to get solid manufacturing jobs, who are now having to move into these other kinds of less well-paid jobs. I want to argue that they're also less steady and less reliable.
Basically, one part of it is the polarization, but there's also overall, I mean, is it basically a polarization story, or is there also another dimension story?
A polarization story in the sense that we have this missing middle, the hollowing out of the middle. That is the big part of it.
So that the jobs that exist have actually, the middle one disappear and the other ones, so the same thing, you get more low-skilled jobs or highly automated,
That's right.
high-skilled jobs. But there's also a structural change occurring in the economy beyond
Oh, absolutely. So my interest here is in what's happening to workers and what's happening to households. There's very much a story about the structure of the economy, which is fascinating and important, but not part of what I want to share. Yeah, thanks.
You also looked at the participation rate?
The
Participation rate.
in the labor force.
In the labor force.
Yes, has been falling. So, of course, unemployment has been dipping, but labor force participation has been falling too. So it's a bit misleading.
This one talks about the change in the employment share, but what is the employment share of those earning say about 40K a year? What is the employment share? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
yes, I don't. The employment share is roughly this can't be right. Bottom quintile, middle 60. Yeah, looks like about 18%. Yeah. So that middle is a very big group.
The data is till 2005. So
Yes,
has changed a
that's
lot
right.
after 2008.
So that's a really interesting question. This process has been happening since 1970, right? And has been going quite fast. It slowed down in the 90s. And then what we saw with the recession is this process continued, but really the recession revealed it.
Was also not a good time
Yeah,
for the economy.
yeah, exactly.
But
yeah.
after 2008, 2009, for 6 years, it's been rather bad.
Yes. And we've been able to see more clearly the processes that were happening in the decades before by that moment.
How much of that is due to people coming in?
To immigrants, is that? Well, there's a lot of debate about that. So I can't give a definitive answer in any way whether immigrants have been coming in as a response to the possibilities that have been opened up, or whether they're causing these changes. My sense is mostly the former, right? That the changes have driven this. I think the biggest changes are not globalization, or common wisdom, as you probably know, not so much globalization as automation.
Is the technology of the automation is such that the middle management automatically vanishes? Is that the particular point that how far we have been able to study those aspects of it? Because when high skill comes, only the high skill middle management will not be there, because we can manage it automatically. So what is the
Right.
logic behind this to fill the gap? Can you get to that point?
It's an interesting question. Right? A lot of the job loss has been middle management, also clerical jobs, administrative jobs, jobs that are now being automated. But I don't want to go into great detail on what's going on exactly with the labor market, because my focus here is on something that we've been missing, which is not just what's happening in aggregate, but what's happening in people's lives, right? And that's a story I want to share, because it's a story that's been hard to see. Usually we have annual data, right? You don't really get to see any household in particular. You just have the aggregate numbers, and we write our papers and reports about trends. But people's lives aren't lived in the aggregate. The aggregate annual data, annual incomes, it smooths out what's happening throughout the year. Life for households is lived day to day, week to week, right? In the sense of a diary. And in fact, that's what we set out to do. We set out to collect data on households' ups and downs, day by day and week by week. Stepping away from the usual way that data is collected, maintaining our economic frame, but a very, very different way of getting an insight into households. And in this, we're drawing from work in Bangladesh, India, and South Africa, where the financial diary approach that's at the heart here was developed. So to give a sense from an economic standpoint, what's innovative here, and what I want to share is usually when we think about inequality and when we think about trends in the economy, we track income, right? When we're trying to understand what's happening to households. Often, with Piketty and others, we turn to wealth or assets. And what I want to argue is there's a missing lens, and that is cash flow. Tracking cash flows really gives us an insight into where households are tripping up, where they're getting into trouble, where they're seizing opportunities and getting ahead. It's only there that you can really see the action. So what we did is we set out this research team, 10 people, in different parts of the US. I'll show you where. They met with families every 2 to 4 weeks. And they had a specialized survey. We built a database. And they collected data on what the households were earning, borrowing, saving, spending, every financial transaction to the best we could. Every transaction that had been happening day by day. Not only when it was, but how it was done, whether cash or in kind, whether it was a gift between friends. That was the idea, high frequency data. We very rarely do this. We rarely have the capacity. This is a fairly small sample. but we felt it was important. So for 244 households, we collected over 300,000 cash flows. We had 100 different spending categories, 38 income types. You can get a sense of the intensity of this. We focused on working families, so families with a worker. We weren't focused on the poorest of the poor. We weren't focused on the very rich. We were focused on exactly those families in the middle, right? They were a casino worker in Mississippi, someone selling fruit on the sidewalks of New York City, a tax accountant in Brooklyn, office worker in Ohio, just different families who were just part of the core of the American economy, but who seemed to be undergoing some radical transformations which were hard to understand and which we're only now starting to reckon with. So 235 households is not a lot in a country of 300 million. And we had to choose carefully where we were going to work. Again, the sample couldn't be too big or we'd lose sight of the families. So part of the sample was in California, part of it in eastern Mississippi, part of it in Ohio and Kentucky in the middle, which is a real Republican stronghold and a center of manufacturing, and then New York City, close to where I work at New York University, but a place that's sort of much more cosmopolitan. We had immigrants, and we were tracking immigrants from Mexico, from India, from Bangladesh, from Ecuador, Colombia. That was a big focus. We had many white families, black families. It was a real mix, just trying to understand different experiences. Thank you.
How different is it from Townsend's work in Thailand? Because very similar kind of motivation. Because the cash flow element is being
Yeah. So Rob Townsend, this professor at MIT, has done something really remarkable in Thailand, which has a similar feeling. It's month-by-month data. Townsend's work is designed to try to understand local economies in a very structured way. He comes with some hypotheses. He wants to test those, taking economic theory very seriously and imposing that onto the structure of data collection. We did something very different, although similar. I had no clear hypotheses. I mean, I had a few, I read the newspaper. I have sort of a sense of what's going on. I just wanted to collect data without putting structure on it and try to understand what was happening in people's lives through their own sort of conversations sitting at the kitchen table, but also then follow their data and see the patterns in the data and how they match up. So I wanted to tell an economic story, but I didn't want to start by testing a preconceived idea. And so that's the difference. And maybe in that sense, it's a bit, economists were deductive, usually, and this is very inductive, more like anthropology or sociology. It's harder or differently hard, but certainly not usual. But it seemed like the right kind of thing to really get a sense of something that was going on that was hard to see. And so my wife's an anthropologist, so she hates when I say that it's more like anthropology, but it's my version.
But the British economists work that way.
They used to, yeah.
And the US one does the way Townsend did.
Yeah, exactly. This year I'm on leave at a place called the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and they have this amazing library that no one ever visits. And in there they have all these 19th century books that are gathering dust. And it turns out that in the 19th century, social scientists were doing this kind of work, just collecting budget, seeing how people live. But it's very old hat. But I hope there's something interesting in going back to the way we used to do things, at least once. Yeah, many.
Could you share something about how you chose the families?
No, it's a great question. I should have mentioned that. So there's no sense in which this is a nationally representative sample. There's no random sampling at all. So we chose the families trying to be representative of typical situations. So we had different ethnic groups, for example, in communities. We looked for, everyone had to have a working member, but we looked for some families that had single members versus young families, for example, some female-headed households. So we're looking by category rather than trying to be statistically representative. But what I want to show you, and this wasn't exactly part of the plan, but it worked out, is that early on the donor said, when we got some early results, they said, go out there and start talking about them. And I said, I'm an academic, I can't go and share my half-baked ideas yet. You know, Manny, you're used to this, right? But I did, because they're the donors. And that was actually powerful. So I gave talks at the Fed, and I gave talks at the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, and gave talks at the big Washington think tanks. And one of the remarkable things is then they said, oh, well, we can do better than what you're doing, because we're collecting big nationally representative data sets, and we'll figure out some questions that pick up on what you're doing and see if they're actually playing out in our data. And so the donors actually were right. I was wrong. And that turned out to be really useful. And I'll show you what they found in the nationally representative, statistically appropriate samples. But the power of what we have is something that they don't have in their nationally representative samples, which is that I actually got to know the people. I actually got to know the families, and I could see them well, and I could go back and ask them, like, what happened in November that led to this dip, or how did that health problem get resolved? And so one of the families that really represents this sort of second version of insecurity. The first one being these big year-to-year catastrophic problems, like losing your job. This second version is represented by a family we call Becky and Jeremy. It's not their real names. We changed names to maintain confidentiality. But Becky and Jeremy, they live in Ohio. They have 4 children. And Jeremy is a truck mechanic. So he fixes those huge trucks that go on the highway that take goods from one place to another. He fixes those trucks. Jeremy works on commission at a garage. So for however many trucks he works on, he gets a share of the revenue. So I was visiting with Becky one spring day. It was actually this day that I took that photograph. And it was a beautiful day. And Becky, Jeremy's wife, was in a terrible mood. I said, Becky, why are you in such a bad mood? This is just a beautiful day. Everyone's happy. The kids are outside riding their bicycles. And she said, I just don't know what Jeremy's paycheck is going to be next month. Spring is terrible for us. And it turned out that if you earn your living fixing trucks on commission, that good weather is really bad for you, right? Because the trucks do okay. Right? They break down when it's incredibly hot during the summer. Right? The tires blow and the trucks have problems. They do badly in the winter when it's just so cold and the alternators go and the batteries go. But on beautiful spring days, Becky was in a terrible mood. And I want to show you what that means. This is their income ups and downs. You can see their income's going up and down, their spending is going up and down. And even though their annual income was $35,000 a year, which is sort of in the middle of the US distribution, and even though Jeremy had a steady job, he did not have steady paychecks. And that was a realization that we only really came to see clearly by doing this crazy data exercise. We came to see how ubiquitous those ups and downs had that problem of having a steady job, right? US unemployment rate, 4.3%. People have jobs, but they don't have steady paychecks. And that's because Jeremy was working on commission, but we saw it with people working on tips. We saw people with hourly wages who wouldn't get steady hours week after week. And that is a story that I'll show both in our data and in the national data. So just to show this picture. So tax time in the US is a time when most of us hate paying our taxes. I have to write a big check to the government. However, people who are lower income, like Becky and Jeremy, they actually usually get a refund, right? That's because one of our most effective social insurance programs is the earned income tax credit, right, which matches your income if you're a low-income family. So it's a big chunk, and if I included that chunk, then it would flatten out the picture and you wouldn't be able to see anything. So I took it out so you could see that the earnings are going up and down. Jeremy's actual earnings, rather than just this artificial lump that comes with tax refunds. It usually comes in March or April. It depends. The people who are expecting it, they try to fill out their taxes as soon as possible so that they can get it as soon as possible. It turns out to be a massively important transfer for many households. Okay. So we'll come back to Becky and Jeremy a bit later, but I want to show what's happening in the rest of the data. So this is summarizing data across our sample, our 235 families. In these 235 families, one way of measuring volatility is simply counting how many months was income 25% or more above average, and how many months was it 25% or more below average. We call it spikes or dips, capturing these extreme variations. Now for me, my income is really very steady. I'm an academic, and NYU pays me the same thing every month, so I would be my average is pretty much the same as, it's pretty much the same every month. But here we saw in this population 2.2 spikes, 2.2 months with spikes, that is, and 2.4 months with dips on average. So 5 months out of the year, the households didn't have income within 25% of their average. That we started to see was profound. Because when your income's going up and down and when it's unpredictable, it's hard to plan, it's hard to budget, it's hard to do a lot of the things that financial advisors tell American families to do. And that started to give us a new lens on why so many families were feeling anxious even though they had jobs. So that's our little sample of 235 households. But as I mentioned, we started talking about this, and the Federal Reserve then added a question into their national survey called the Survey of Household Economic Decision Making. So this is from a sample of about 6,000 households. It comes from a panel of 50,000. It's actually 7,000 here. 7,000 nationally representative households. And they were asked a simple question: how many months out of the year is your income varying somewhat, and how much is it varying quite a bit from one month to the next? So most households said they had fairly steady income. But we can see here that many, around 20%, experienced some unusually high or low months. And another chunk, that's the color on top, said that their income often varies quite a bit. So two important things. Three important things. One, many households do have fairly steady income and they're doing better. Two, the most insecurity is at the lowest incomes, and particularly among the poor. I'm going to come back to poverty at the end, but we too often miss the fact that the problem of the poor is not just low income, it's also very unsteady income, and that really compounds problems. And the third issue is that these issues with volatility are stretching into the middle class. On the right, these are people who are earning $100,000 or more, still experiencing ups and downs. Some of it are good ups and downs, but a lot of it are problems and lost income. Yeah. So what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean?
Jonathan, if you're saying that these fluctuations in income has increased during this period from 80 to 2005, then the precautionary mode to save should go up. I mean, we should see a dip in consumption. But we don't see that dip in consumption in the US, at least during this period. In fact, I think from 2000 onwards, actually it went up. So if households can borrow their way out of this, then should we really be concerned about this?
No, we shouldn't. Yes, we should. And there are two reasons. One, first I just want to say that I don't have the evidence. No one's done this kind of study until now. So I can't say that it's so different from 1970, 1980. I can just say this is a part of the condition of American families today. In subsequent work using the Federal Reserve data, actually I'm interested in this question of precautionary savings, right? Because if you see that you're in this situation, you should anticipate it, you should build up savings, and then you can just smooth it away, no problem. What we actually see is that the households that have the greatest volatility actually have the least ability to save up in that way. Right? There are households that are saving in a precautionary way. They tend to have more stable income. This is actually, so the irony of this is that the households that most need to save have the hardest time doing it because of the instability that they're kind of caught in the middle of, right? Saving is much easier when your income is steady, but the people with steady income actually need that saving less, at least for precautionary moves. Something like that, yeah.
But does this include the tax month thing, your graph, or this is just for...
We took the tax month out again. Otherwise, it would have added another month of spikes.
So
that's
maybe,
right, just
maybe
earnings.
that's part of the answer to this question.
I also think when you say consumption, what kind of consumption?
So here,
Because if it is basic consumption, you need that. That is your necessary life.
Right.
But if you're thinking of like white goods or something, that is a different story again.
right. I mean, for these households, it really is fairly basic consumption. When there are dips, then households are suffering. I'll show you a little bit more about that, especially on health. We're seeing households, not fulfilling their prescriptions or not taking all their medicines because of these problems. But I'll get there in a moment. So one of the sort of key ways that this changes how we think about financial advice is that in the US, a good financial advisor will sit you down and talk to you about the life cycle, right? Or a good economist thinking about savings will turn to Modigliani and all the sort of life cycle theory that you're drawing on and just say that's the real savings problem. This assumption that really the problem, the financial problem of households is preparing for the big things that are going to come in the future, retirement, buying a house, sending your kids to college, all of that. That's what constitutes the important part of a financial life. And the assumption was that to get there, you should do what I do, which is I have a salaried job. NYU takes a chunk of my income. They put it in a retirement account. I have a savings account for kids' college. That's what should happen. But I'm not typical. What we see, or that model, assumes some basic liquidity, assumes some basic stability. It assumes that you have already some way to deal with these ups and downs. And what I want to argue is that at the heart of this is that that long-term security, which is the focus of so much financial sort of attention in the US and in other places, that long-term financial security is undermined by short-term financial insecurity. And it's been hard to see because we don't collect data at that level. So very quickly, another household we got to know is a woman named Janice. She lives in Mississippi. She's a casino card dealer. Gambling is not allowed in most of the US, but the Native American Indian reservations have gotten licenses to open casinos. Now you see them in lots of places. Janice is not Native American. She's an African American woman, but she works in a casino dealing cards. She works for tips. So when the gamblers have a good hand, they'll throw some money in her box. If they're having a bad hand or they don't show up, of course she doesn't do so well. So like Jeremy, the risk of the business is being in part, putting onto Janice's shoulders. What I want to show you, this is what her casino looks like with all these machines. She actually deals cards at tables. Is that her income then looks like this. In the summer, this is another seasonal story, but they're not all seasonal. In the summer, she's doing well. People are gambling, they're coming out, the weather is good, the kids are out of school, and they're at the casino, and so June, July, August, she makes most of her money. We could track her paychecks. But when fall comes, people stop coming to the casino in such numbers. American football is on television, so you stay home and watch TV instead of going to the casino. Also, kids are in school, and so they're staying back. That's all good. Janice says, oh, that's great. They should be home. They shouldn't be here. But she feels it in her paycheck. And so her livelihood is bound up, even though she's a very devout Christian who doesn't like gambling at all. Her life is bound up with the gamblers. And as I said, she's bearing this risk. And that's an important part of this story. I skipped a slide. I'm going to go back to it if I can find it, and then I'll go forward a second. And that's this, which sort of unifies how this plays out nationally. So we just saw Janice, we just saw Becky and Jeremy. I showed you some other data. This is another national data point. This is data from a survey collected by the Pew Charitable Trusts, right? Another big think tank in Washington. So they have a big survey, and they ask households, if you had the choice between moving a rung up the income ladder, hi BJ, a rung up the income ladder or having a more stable financial life, which would you choose? You could think about it for yourselves, right? Which would you choose, being a little richer or having a bit more stability? Right? Stability. Yeah? Well, you join 92% of Americans who also opt for stability. Right? This is, I think, striking to a lot of people. Maybe it's not striking to you, but striking to a lot of observers. And it's really in line with what we're seeing. And Becky and Janice also would opt for stability, even though they're struggling with their incomes. And so, let me move forward to where I was. And part of that is because of these ups and downs in income, and together ups and downs in expense needs. I'll give you a little bit of a sense of these ups and downs a little more carefully now and some more
But the answer
national
to that
data.
question will depend on your anticipation of running up the ladder. If you have
true.
low threshold of income and you don't expect, so you ask them the question, would you like to be very rich or obviously stability, I'm facing such difficult times because of instability.
Right. And it's obvious once they respond, right? It wasn't so obvious before, right? Because it had been hard to see. The assumption had been that most Americans are struggling and income has been stagnant for 3 decades. Who wouldn't want a little bit more income? Right?
No, but it all depends. Again, it's the threshold. If you are below, if you are vulnerable, you'd like reasonably. It's not stability at the low level of income. It's a stability at probably the peak level of income that they want. So it's not stability on its own. But since they can't go beyond the peak, they can't run up the ladder.
So you're saying they actually want both?
They want reduced vulnerability with stability.
Yeah. Yeah. The Pew Charitable Trusts themselves can't really figure out what's going on exactly. But I think the key thing is that this set of issues around vulnerability is something we need to take more seriously, and wasn't until we had more data like that. And that's really the importance of this work. And so we have examples of, in our sample, about half were expecting income and didn't get it at some important time. About half had a vehicle repair expense that was over $100, which is quite a lot for some of these households. So there were a whole series of things like this. We see in the US transport costs rising over the last few decades, health costs rising, housing costs rising. Core inflation's been fairly low, but certain parts of inflation are rising much faster than average, and those parts are hitting these families hard. And so we came to see that there's a kind of hidden inequality. Right? And it's an inequality where, better off Americans can assume some steadiness of income and expenses, and they have fairly strong coping mechanisms if they need it. But there's another group which is struggling, and they have neither stability nor those coping mechanisms, and together that's the real problem, right? It's like what it's asking, right? They'd be fine if they had the coping mechanisms, right? Could save for precautionary purposes. But they can't, and that's the fact that they're in that bottom corner is this kind of inequality that's creating a cleavage between a secure America and an insecure America.
During this time also the health and the education expense, the prices are going up as well.
Yes.
Wouldn't it also affect, wouldn't it make these households even more vulnerable? Because I'm assuming that they don't have access to health insurance.
Yeah.
Even though they don't have a regular job, they have to. So that would also sort of add up out here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is exactly right. I'm about to get to health in a moment. First, I want to share a little bit more evidence, and it's not evidence that we collected, but evidence that is part of this conversation that the Federal Reserve collected in that same national survey. And this ties to Morduch's question in a way. So the survey asked a set of, I think, helpful questions that, again, surprised a lot of people. So the first question was, if you had a problem, if you had some difficulty, and you needed to come up with $400 very quickly, could you do it? Or how would you do it? Right? So $400 is a big enough chunk that it's not that easy to come up with, but it's not such a big number, right? And the question was, could you come up with it from your saving or put it on a credit card and just pay it off quickly? Or would you have to do something else? And the number that struck so many people was that 47% of Americans, nearly half of America, said they wouldn't be able to get hold of that $400 from available money they had. They'd have to borrow it and pay it off over time, or they'd have to sell something to deal with it. So we got hold of the Fed data, right? Because we were interested in this. This was headlines throughout America that so many Americans don't have that kind of money. This was interesting to us because when you've got these ups and downs, you assume, well, people can deal with ups and downs by saving and borrowing, but clearly they can't. So we got hold of the data because we wanted to see how that played out across the income distribution. And it's very much like what we saw in the data I showed you earlier on people's income volatility. It's the poorest who are, of course, having the greatest difficulty. Here we see about 3/4 of respondents either say they can't come up with $400 at all in any way, or they would have to borrow or sell something to come up with that money. And again, even households earning over $100,000, almost 1/4 of them, say they don't have $400 that they can just get hold of.
1/4 of respondents below 25,000 came up with the answer they can actually get it.
Yes, right. That's
How do
right.
they manage it?
Well, people can people do save, or they, right. There's heterogeneity, but it's not easy. They may have more stability, or they may have inherited a little bit of money, and or sometimes one of those big refunds, those tax refunds they grab.
You have to borrow or sell.
Like that.
If you inherit something, you have to sell it to get the money.
Oh no, well, you might have inherited it a few years ago, and then you keep it in the bank.
So you mean that's the asset part?
That's the asset part. Yeah. But a tax refund could do it. So that's like the point is that if you had a car crash, you couldn't fix your car, then that can have some ripple effects as well. Then you can't get to your job, then you lose your job. And that's the kind of story we're starting to see.
One, does this survey or information happen through our networks, in the sense that relying upon friends, family, and secondly, do you have any sense for somebody earning over $100,000
Yeah, no, that's
So
the
why?
others, right? 3% saying you can't even get 400.
Yeah. So the first question, networks. This survey doesn't have great questions on networks, but in our data, we ask a lot about them. In terms of borrowing from family and friends, often with zero interest loans, is the second most important form of borrowing. Credit cards, number one, but borrowing from family and friends is very, very, very close. Much more important than a lot of the other financial mechanisms, lending mechanisms that get a lot of attention. But again, it doesn't show up in the usual data. Yeah. So that's $400. This is a 3-month problem. Let's say you lose your job or you have a really bad health catastrophe. Do you have enough saved up to cover 3 months? Well, clearly, if you don't have $400, you don't have 3 months either. And you'd expect this to be greater, but you can see, I mean, for the poorest, really very, very few have 3 months saved up. That's 59, but 65, 75% wouldn't be able to deal with that through a simple way. Go back.
Just one. Yeah. So no, the previous one.
Something just happened.
That 3%.
Yeah. You had a question, can I go back? And the answer is no, apparently. Maybe I should go this way. We'll get there. Almost there. We're there.
Yeah. So this is, the last one is 24%. Let's go.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is 37%. Yeah.
37%
couldn't cover 3 months.
can't stay for 3 months.
Yeah,
But
and 17% would have really no obvious way to do it. Yeah, it's striking. So this is this is America's economic anxiety. I mean, I don't want to can't draw a tight line to what's happening politically. Clearly, this is in the background of life. I'm going to quickly jump over some issues around health to get to just a few thoughts on saving and poverty. Okay? So just on health, maybe it shouldn't be surprising that in this context, households then have a hard time dealing with health problems that emerge. Now, Obamacare, we've been talking a lot about it, and today you've probably just heard the attempt to repeal Obamacare just failed, right? It's unbelievable. No one expected it. So Obamacare is still the law of the land, but when you spend time with families, you start to realize that even Obamacare, right, which is our health insurance, it's our affectionate term for our health insurance, even Obamacare has problems, right? Everyone's mandated they have to buy a health insurance contract, but the contracts that are available are often expensive, right? If you don't have $400, how are you going to? You're probably a person who would have a hard time paying a big insurance premium. So what most of the families we got to know do is they buy a contract that has fairly low premiums, right? They just don't have the money. What that means is those same contracts have fairly high deductibles. So when something happens, that means they have to pay out of pocket for a bigger chunk of it than other people. And thus, we see that when health problems are happening, the households really are having difficulties. I just want to quickly show what we see in our data. And we can look very closely at different parts of it. We have many insured and some uninsured people, because our survey was happening just as Obamacare was coming in. And what we saw was sort of systematic delays, say, in filling prescriptions. The doctor says you have to take these medicines. Systematically, our households were often delaying. So you can see for the uninsured, about a third of them were delaying their prescriptions. But even the insured, about 18%. I mean, for me, I'm someone, the doctor tells me to do something, I go and do it. But so it was eye-opening to me to see, in America, families which are fairly similar, not doing that. Taking less medicine, skipping doses, cutting pills literally with a knife and taking parts of it, and just some going outside the country to find cheaper prescriptions, but a whole series of calculations that households are making that are financial and ultimately possibly jeopardizing health. So that's another layer of this situation we're in that we've been missing. So we've talked about health, we've talked about volatility, we're talking about saving. I want to say a little bit more about saving and a frame for thinking about saving. And then the last thing will be poverty. So when we think about saving as economists, we usually think about this question that we might face, which is, should I consume something now? Should I go out for a nice meal? Should I do something now and just indulge? Or should I put it off, save, and then consume later? Right? So it's now versus later. And as economists, that's a very natural way to just think about that kind of binary choice. What we saw with these households was something more complicated than that. And that was a choice between now, soon, and later. That there was a real distinction between saving for the long term, saving for retirement, saving for college, saving for a house, and saving for something coming up in 2 or 3 months. So this soon, something within the year, became a really important sort of focal point of saving for families, right? And it had to be. You can see, this is really the heart of Morduch's question. What that meant, though, was that it really changes how we look at the data on saving in America. If you look at the data on saving in America, you can see very low savings rates. And the response often is, Americans are lousy savers. They're just indulgent. They're always going out to McDonald's. They're buying new cars all the time. They have these iPhones and fancy sneakers. And, they need to get some discipline and exercise personal responsibility. And so the idea is people must be overspending because we don't see much saving. Right? But what we actually see in our data is something more complicated, which is that people are saving, largely saving. People aren't perfect. There are a lot of mistakes and plenty of iPhones that were purchased and meals that were eaten. But a lot of saving was actually getting done. But it was saving for soon. It was saving for something in 3 months or 6 months because they had to be. And so we don't see long-term saving. Retirement accounts are still underfunded. People haven't saved up enough for housing. All sorts of things like that. But it is not that saving isn't happening. And so the saving choice becomes very different. It's not about temptation, right? Just reckless indulgence in one's joys. It's about often a choice between saving for later, saving for soon. It's about two different kinds of postponements of gratification. And that's a very different way of thinking about financial choices and discipline. So we see in our data that we looked at everyone's savings accounts. We have data on when people spent their money. And what we see is that 92% of checking accounts or current accounts were spent within a year. Even savings accounts, which are earmarked for saving rather than transactions, about 60% were spent within a year. And we haven't paid enough attention to that problem, and government policies and financial advice isn't directed toward helping people save in this way, even though it's vital, and even though we see these problems of households not having enough money to deal with ups and downs. So that's saving, and the last thing I want to talk about is poverty.
So I have a question about the credit card loans that these people have. So when they took credit card loans, how much of interest would they pay on a month-to-month basis or whatever? And how often did they take credit card loans? Yeah.
That is an interesting question. In general, credit card costs are adding about 20% over a year.
20%.
About 20%. We see that of our sample, about 3/4 of them are not paying off the full balance. So when I borrow my credit card, I just pay it off. I never have to pay any interest unless I make a mistake, and I do that. But about 78% are just not paying it off, so they are borrowing at about 20%. even though their resources are limited. What I just want to say, what we don't see very much of, so credit cards are a big deal. And I think people are being exploited by the credit card companies in many ways. But we don't see a lot of payday lending and other, what are called predatory or exploitative forms of lending that get a lot of attention. They're a very small part of the picture for these families and also in the national data. But they get attention because they are so kind of outrageously exploitative. But it's really the credit card companies that are affecting many more households, less exploitation, but still huge welfare losses.
The budgeting, the liability, the income and the expenditure, and the saving, then we have the investment, and plus the national contribution to the social security. All these entire structure can build up the individuals or the family, the total budgeting. Because this is the entire holistic parameters on which the family exists. And he has to work on all these parameters.
Yeah.
So at the national level, the national security becomes very paramount. And unless and until, if suppose I get an ESI and I put $1,000 in my yearly income, and the government also puts 2,000 or 1,000 more, so it comes to 2,000 a year. So in 10 years it becomes 20,000. Is that a particular prism you have taken into account? And then my education of my children are free, like in Scandinavian countries?
So do I think those would be good policies to have in America?
Yes.
Yes, I do. What we see is the opposite in America. College education, public schools, right? My oldest child is 15, so he'll be going to college in a few years. It used to be that if you went to a public university in my state, he would pay very little. But increasingly, even public institutions charge quite high prices. The safety net, right, the social insurance safety net, is very fragile. The poorest households have very little to rely on. There's a recent study that of very poor households, and they didn't even know there were public programs. They had just withered so much. And in the US, as you may know, the federal government has policies, but then each state gets to determine how they are implemented. So if you live in New York or California, they're quite generous. If you live in Mississippi, where Janice lives, they're not very generous at all.
So the individual, family has to pay from saving and investment, which makes, because the money becomes, deflated every year because of its inflation growth.
Yeah.
So but that investment point has not been.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah. It's a very good point. And we'll maybe in the end when we have more discussion we can talk about policy. I'll just say one last thing, if I may, and then draw to a close. And that one last thing is poverty. So I spent a lot of time thinking about poverty in my career in various ways, thinking about poverty in India. There's huge debates here about how to set the poverty line and how to measure consumption and things like this. What is often missing, at least in the US, and I actually think here, is the variation of income that leads, well, let me put it a different way. We often think of poverty as a binary situation. Either you're poor or you're not poor. Either you're below the poverty line or you're above the poverty line, right? BPL or not. That's a very natural way to think about it, but it doesn't line up with the data. And I want to show you why. I don't want to show you this. I don't want to show you that. I want to show you this. This is the distribution of income in the US. We see the pattern. You can see there's a big hump there. That hump is around $25,000. It's about where the poverty line is. Right? We have some very rich households. We have some poorer households. But the modal income is around the poverty line. Now think about that modal income. There's this big chunk of people who are right there, close to the poverty line on either side. Now think about some variability that we've just been looking at, this income volatility. And then it's very easy to see that in fact this idea of being above the poverty line or below the poverty line as a sort of stable condition just is unlikely to hold. What we see is people moving in and out of poverty with great frequency. In the US, we have about 60 million people. Okay? 60 million people between the poverty line and twice the poverty line. So there's a lot of people who are very close to the poverty line. So in our data, if we look at this, SPM is a new poverty line in the US. If we look at the poverty line, this is twice the poverty line, this is 1.5 times the poverty line. This is our data, so it's only 235 households. But we see 56% of the households between 1.5 times, 150% of the poverty line and 200 spent some time below the poverty line. Becky and Jeremy, who I mentioned, $35,000, they were above the poverty line on average. Nevertheless, because of these ups and downs, the winter months, the spring months and the fall months, they spent 5 months of the year actually below the poverty line. And Becky and Jeremy didn't know how to think about that. They were not poor, and yet they were poor. And when that happened, they got food stamps, the government program, and they got some state-provided health insurance. But Becky felt terrible about it because it didn't really figure with how she saw themselves and how they actually lived. But this ups and downs were fairly common. In fact, households a little poorer, almost all of them spent some time, even though they were on average not poor, they spent some time below the poverty line. Even households a little bit higher, 32%, who on average were well above the poverty line, spent at least a month below the poverty line. And by the same token, some of the households, many of the households we met below the poverty line actually spent some time above the poverty line. This is a finding similar to what we saw in India and Bangladesh in the earlier work, where our conclusion on dollar-a-day poverty was that one of the great challenges of dollar-a-day poverty is that no one actually earns $1 a day, literally. Right? And this is really something very similar in the US. 3/4 of poverty spells in the US last less than a year. You're not going to be able to see this one, but the point of this one, this is national level data showing that between 2009 and 2012, looking month by month, about 10 million Americans were poor all the time. 90 million Americans were poor at some point during that period. 1/3 of America had some experience below the poverty line between 2009 and 2012. So the idea of poverty being a condition that, that just one isolated, marginalized group of Americans are experiencing doesn't hold in the data. Many households close to the poverty line, they experience poverty too, and our programs are not designed to even address that. And what happens is these programs like food stamps and health insurance get sort of pulled and pushed to try to accommodate it. And that's my conclusion. As we think about what to do going forward, we need to embrace these issues of instability and unpredictability. Policies that can help promote greater stability, partly bargaining rights for workers, collective action. President Obama had a scheduling legislation which said that people who were working in firms of a certain size had to be told ahead of time what their schedule was going to be, and it had to guarantee some basic hours. Something like that could go some distance in addressing this issue. And then the other side is strengthening financial mechanisms that allow people to save and borrow and address these issues. So those are my thoughts on what's going on with American families once we spend some time with them and try to understand where their anxieties are and what their hopes are and how they want to try to move ahead. Thanks. Sanjay, hi, nice to see you. Thank you.
A couple of questions. The first one is simply, what are Trump's policies? I mean, how are Trump's policies going to affect it? The obvious question in a sense. But the other one, Jonathan, you came to it right at the end. Your slides on shocks. It would have been interesting to see some comparison with portfolios of the poor.
Yeah.
How do the poor in America, in America cope with shocks? That's what you
talked about, how does that relate to the manner in which the poor in India cope with shocks? Since, I mean, you're here to talk about America, but you are in India, so it would have been nice to see that.
Yeah. I really like the idea of being at a development seminar talking about the U.S. It's a sign of where we are.
Can I elaborate on the last question?
Please.
The very last point that you made, rather than comparing America with India, you started off looking at, what has changed or what has happened over the last 30 years or 40 years. Has that part changed? Was it true, say, in the boom years or in the 90s that larger share experienced poverty? Most of it.
Yeah, those are good. Sure. So let's start with Sanjay's first question. Trump. I guess it was inevitable that you would ask, and I'm glad you did. So Trump's policies are hard to pin down because he has lots of tweets, but they're not moving into legislation, right? But certainly, massive tax cuts to the rich, which seem to be underneath a lot of his policies, are not going to do any good for those of us who are interested in strengthening the safety net.
$100,000 income people who can't find $400 to spend.
That's exactly right. So, no, that's right. I think we're talking about a post-Trump world if we're going to make some progress. And yet, there is interest in this. After you write a book, journalists call up, and a journalist from Breitbart News, which is Steve Bannon's outlet, was very interested in this, and we had an interview. And it's because the population here, a large part of them is Trump voters. Right? Becky and Jeremy are the kind of people who would vote for Trump. And so there is some hope that, as things evolve, that they may turn to actually trying to create some policies that work for their base. The question about shocks, there's two questions. One is what's happened over time. The other is how does this look different from what we saw with Portfolios of the Poor. So Portfolios of the Poor was a book that was based on what we saw in India and Bangladesh. And what we saw in India and Bangladesh was a lot of action trying to deal with the ups and downs that poor families face. The problem of not earning literally $1 a day, but earning $10 one day and nothing for 2 weeks, and having to deal with those ups and downs. And what we saw with Portfolios of the Poor was people very actively saving, not despite poverty, but because of the condition of poverty. And the savings mechanisms were often, there was borrowing, there was saving, there were a whole series of social networks that were being deployed. I think what's similar here is in immigrant groups in the US, we see savings clubs, right? We see Roscas, we see a lot of that actually, and that was something that carried over. What we see in the US though is that the credit card becomes this really powerful financial instrument that the families we got to know, or that Orlando Ruthven here in her work in India, they didn't have. So one of the striking things that Orlando found, and Orlando's a researcher mostly working on labor issues. Here, she lives in Delhi. She did work she had a sample in UP and she had a sample here in Southwest Delhi. What Orlando found in the Indian sample was that the families she got to know were starting a fresh financial arrangement, borrowing some money, or saving with a money guard, or joining a savings club, on average, every 2 weeks. So constant regeneration of savings devices and savings connections. They'd be using some microfinance. They'd be borrowing with family and some friends, all at the same time. These were complementary, not substituting devices. And so that activeness of kind of financial engagement was less true in the US sample because they had this credit card that they could always turn to. And that was very dangerous in many ways because debt kept on piling up. So that's another big part of the story. Has this changed? The truth is, I don't exactly know, and this is with regard to poverty, right, the ins and outs of poverty. The data I just put up there is 2009 to 2012, so it's after the recession, so you might say, well, it is an unusual time, and that's true. But not going all the way back, even before the recession in the years before, there's something similar. I think what's happened in the US with regard to poverty is some shifts. So about 50 years ago, there was a very, very influential book by Michael Harrington called The Other America, right? And in Harrington's world, the poor in America were isolated in Kentucky, Appalachia, right? Distant from others. Or in the inner city, again, very distant. I think what we've seen in America with poverty is an increasing movement out of those areas, moving into suburban areas, sort of greater integration. My sense is that these phenomena, and we don't have the data, but that it's intensified. That this movement up and down and in and out of poverty has grown greater. But
related, for example, Rajchetty's work on...
Yes. Connects to Rajchetty's work. He's looking at mobility for the most part. But it's average income, right, over a year and over generations, right? What Rajchetty's not able to look at is the variation around those trends. And that's the issue. But there were so this is a bit of a diversion, but very quickly, when Bill Clinton became president and wanted to change anti-poverty policy, right? And he changed welfare as we know it. That was based on evidence that David Ellwood, who's a Harvard professor, had brought from the PSID, the Michigan study, which was showing ups and downs of poverty, and they were trying to address it, but fundamentally that legislation didn't work. So it has been part of the experience. I think it's just greater now than it was. Probably a minute why don't I take a round of questions, and then we should, I think, pull it together. So why don't we start in the back?
Hi, my name is Sahil. I attended maybe the past 1 hour of your talk, so I haven't heard previous to that, but I have two quick questions. One is, do you see what's happening with employment contracts now as a kind of adjustment to the previous mode of engagement with employers, where you had a lot of legacy costs, defined benefit contribution schemes in pensions and so forth, now turning more into defined, different kind of schemes. So pushing the risks more onto the customers and employees, and what it means for India, which is venturing into labor market reforms in terms of the structure of contracts, and do you see? The second is, this is still tied to the formal lending system in the US, the credit card system, which you mentioned previously is not predatory lending. But what we see on the contrary in India is large informalization of labor. So you have 93% roughly that's in the informal sector, where lending tends to be predatory in certain ways, in terms of the flexibility of payments and mortgage, all of that. So do you see similar trends happening in India? What are the cautionary tales for India today?
Okay. And I'll take this one question again, and then let's take this question back here, and then I should probably wrap up.
It's the square that you said where you were talking on the one hand of employment conditions and on the other hand of coping mechanism.
Yes.
Now, both with reference to Clinton and that to Trump, how would you place the last, say, 5 presidents in terms of the relative importance they gave to either axis on trying to address vulnerability, and has that been changing? Because you could address that equally well by looking at either of those axes and both.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think who the last 5 presidents are. I think I can go back to Reagan, but not Carter, is that right? On the question about employment contracts, I think there's just a big point, I'll just say briefly, which is captured in your question, which is the shift in power between employers and employees has led to a shift in risk in systematic ways, and moving from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution pensions is one manifestation of it. Another manifestation is hourly workers now being, their hours are determined by algorithms, and there's greater variability there. For us in the US, also commissions, tips, other things like that. And so it's part of a bigger problem of who bears risk. And it's the people who are least well able to bear that risk who are increasingly being asked to bear it. So it's a generic phenomenon. On predatory lending, there's so many other people in this room who could say much more than I could, so I'm not going to embarrass myself. But I know they're people I've learned from, who I see as my mentors in this room, who would have important things to say on that. The last 5 presidents, this hasn't really been a big conversation in general, right? I think one of the phenomena which have led to this, though, is the decline in the power of unions. It's partly happening because sectors that were unionized have declined, but also partly a general push against collective action. If we're going to lay that on someone's feet, it would be Ronald Reagan. You probably remember there were these air traffic controllers. They went on strike. He said, "We're firing all of you." And that was the beginning of the story.
Great. So, thank you, Jonathan. I think this was insightful as ever. Usually, these seminars I discuss a little bit, but this was such an engaging conversation, and the response from the audience was, also so appropriate in terms of, the flow of the book itself, that there was no need for that, frankly. There is a little bit on the Indian scene that we constantly keep talking about, whether it is contractual labor. India is moving towards casualization. So for us, the big concern, and also the seasonality in the agriculture income, that is a concern. Poverty and vulnerability, defined as fluctuations in income, are 2 distinct problems, which will require very different instruments to address, which goes to the heart of targeting, because how do you target this vulnerable moving in and out? So these have profound implications for the kind of policies that India is concerned with currently. But thank you, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
Thank you very much.